This video is about ignoring a woman, what it actually means, why people do it, and whether it's a healthy boundary or a quiet form of emotional control. I want to talk about this the way I would in a therapy room, calmly, honestly, and without pretending the question is simple, because it isn't. Ignoring someone can look like strength to one person and cruelty to another, and the line between the two is thinner than most people are willing to admit. Welcome back to the channel. If this is your first time here, this is a space where we slow things down and look at relationship behavior through a psychological lens, not hype or rage. Today's topic is controversial for a reason. I've sat across from men who felt powerful when they went silent, and I've also sat across from men who felt deeply ashamed afterward. I've listened to women describe silence as abandonment, and others describe it as the moment they finally saw the truth. Same behavior, very different impact. As a therapist, I've learned that ignoring someone is rarely about the other person. It's usually about fear, control, exhaustion, or confusion. People don't withdraw because they're calm and centered. They withdraw because something inside them feels threatened, overwhelmed, or unseen. That's where the dark psychology part comes in. Not because silence is evil, but because it's powerful, and power without awareness tends to harm. This conversation isn't here to attack men or defend women. It's here to question a behavior that gets casually promoted without anyone talking about the emotional consequences. Silence can create space for reflection, or it can quietly destabilize someone's sense of safety. Both can be true, and the difference isn't intention alone, it's self-awareness. I remember early in my practice realizing how often people confuse emotional distance with emotional maturity. They're not the same thing. One builds clarity, the other builds confusion. If you've ever ignored someone and felt justified but strangely empty afterward, or been ignored and felt yourself unravel, this video is for you. We're going to explore this carefully, without drama, without hate, and without pretending there's one clean answer. Just honest psychology, human behavior, and uncomfortable questions worth asking. 1. When silence becomes a weapon. When people talk about ignoring someone, they often dress it up as strength, discipline, or self-control. But in the therapy room, silence shows up very differently. Silence, when used unconsciously, becomes a weapon not because it's loud or aggressive, but because it creates uncertainty. And uncertainty is one of the most destabilizing emotional experiences a human being can have. I've seen this play out many times. Someone withdraws communication and tells themselves they're just staying calm or not reacting. On the surface, that sounds healthy, but beneath it, there's often something else happening. The silence isn't about peace, it's about power. It's about wanting the other person to feel something, confusion, fear, longing, regret, without ever saying it out loud. That's where things quietly cross a line. Silence becomes a weapon when it's used to control an emotional outcome rather than to protect inner stability. There's a big psychological difference between stepping back to regulate yourself and stepping away so the other person will panic, chase, or submit. One is self-respect. The other is emotional manipulation, even if the person doing it doesn't want to admit that to themselves. What makes this especially dangerous is how socially acceptable it looks. No insults, no raised voices, no obvious cruelty, just absence. And absence forces the other person to fill in the blanks. The mind doesn't handle unanswered emotional questions well. It starts creating stories. What did I do wrong? Am I being punished? Am I about to be abandoned? That internal spiral is where silence does its real damage. From experience, I can say that people who rely on this kind of silence often believe they're in control, but they're usually avoiding a deeper fear. Fear of confrontation, fear of vulnerability, fear of being seen as needing something. Silence feels safer than honesty because it avoids exposure. You don't have to risk rejection if you don't speak. You don't have to admit hurt if you disappear. But here's the part many don't expect. When silence is used as a weapon, it doesn't just affect the person being ignored, it reshapes the person using it. Over time, they become emotionally distant, guarded, and disconnected from their own needs. What started as a way to feel powerful slowly turns into emotional isolation. Silence is not wrong by default. Sometimes it's necessary. sometimes it's healing. But the moment silence is used to provoke an emotional response instead of to create clarity, it stops being neutral. It becomes a psychological tool, and every tool has consequences, whether we acknowledge them or not. 2. The difference between space and control. One of the most important distinctions men often miss in relationships is the difference between taking space and exerting control. On the surface, both can look identical. Communication slows down, messages aren't returned, presence is reduced. But psychologically, they come from very different places, and the outcome they create couldn't be more opposite. Taking space is about regulation. It's what a grounded person does when emotions are high and clarity is low. The goal isn't to trigger a reaction in the other person, but to steady yourself. In my experience as a therapist, healthy space usually comes with internal honesty, even if it isn't verbally announced. The person knows why they're stepping back. They're not secretly monitoring how the other person reacts. They're not counting hours or waiting for panic to set in. The nervous system is settling, not strategizing. Control, on the other hand, is externally focused. It's not about calming yourself, it's about influencing someone else's emotional state. When silence is driven by the desire to be missed, feared, chased, or validated, it stops being space and starts becoming leverage. And here's the part many men don't realize. The moment your silence depends on how she reacts, you're no longer in control of yourself. You've handed that control away. I've had conversations with men who genuinely believed they were being strong by withdrawing, but their emotional state was anything but calm. They were checking their phone constantly, replaying conversations, imagining outcomes. That's not space. That's anxiety wearing the mask of discipline. True space feels quieter inside, not louder. Control-based silence often comes from a belief that direct communication is weakness. That belief doesn't appear out of nowhere. It's usually learned through past rejection, humiliation, or feeling powerless in earlier relationships. Silence becomes a workaround. Instead of saying that hurt or I need clarity, the person disappears and lets the other figure it out. It feels safer, but it's also indirect, and indirect strategies almost always create long-term confusion. Educationally, this matters because relationships don't break from conflict as much as they break from unresolved ambiguity. Space can create perspective. Control creates instability. One allows both people to think. The other forces one person to guess. A useful way to check yourself is this: ask why you're silent. If the answer has anything to do with wanting a specific reaction from her, you're not taking space. You're managing perception. That doesn't make you evil, but it does mean you're operating from fear rather than self-respect. Men who learn this distinction tend to shift quickly. They stop disappearing and start choosing intentional distance when needed. They stop using silence as a message and start using it as a reset. That's where real confidence shows up, not in control but in clarity. 3. Why ignoring feels powerful at first. There's a reason so many men are drawn to ignoring a woman early in conflict or tension. It feels powerful. And to be honest, in the moment, it is. But like any short-term high, it comes with hidden costs. Understanding why it feels powerful is one of the most important lessons I share with men in therapy, because it's easy to confuse the sensation of control with true confidence. When you stop responding, when you withhold attention, or when you create absence, the immediate reaction you often see is attention. She texts again, calls back, asks questions, or tries to re-engage. That response creates a psychological feedback loop. Your brain interprets it as validation. I did something right. I'm in control. She notices me. That feeling is intoxicating because humans are wired to respond to acknowledgement, especially from people we care about. Men mistake that emotional reaction for actual authority in the relationship. This sense of power is also amplified because it bypasses vulnerability. Men are taught from a young age that showing need or emotion is weakness, so withdrawing becomes an attractive tool. You don't have to explain, apologize, or expose yourself. You simply become a figure that others must adapt to, and for a moment, that seems like mastery. But here's the catch that many men miss. The power is superficial. It relies entirely on the other person's response. If she doesn't react the way you expect, or worse, if she calls your bluff, the feeling evaporates instantly. Real influence doesn't depend on making someone feel a certain way. Real influence comes from being anchored in yourself, not in how she reacts to your absence. From a psychological perspective, ignoring also taps into the scarcity principle. Humans value what seems rare or unavailable. Silence creates a perception of scarcity. Your presence suddenly feels more significant because it's not guaranteed. This is why the initial rush feels so satisfying. It tricks the mind into thinking you're creating emotional leverage, when in fact you're just creating tension. I've had men tell me they felt proud of themselves after going quiet for a week, believing they showed her who's in charge. But when we broke it down in sessions, the pride came less from actual growth and more from observing her reaction. That's a critical distinction. True confidence doesn't need validation. True confidence can withstand silence without relying on it as a tool. So here's the takeaway for men. The first thrill of ignoring a woman is real. It feels like control. It feels like strength, but it's not a sustainable way to navigate relationships. The power you feel in that moment is a reflection of your ability to provoke a response, not a reflection of emotional maturity, stability, or long-term connection. Understanding that gap is the difference between temporary satisfaction and real relational intelligence. In other words, what feels like power at first is really just a mirage, a shortcut that can backfire if it becomes your default strategy. Recognizing this early prevents men from confusing emotional reaction for genuine influence. 4. What silence does to emotional safety. Let's talk about what silence actually does in a relationship, and I want to make it relatable by referring to a real situation I've seen in my practice. There was a man I'll call James who came to me frustrated because every time he argued or disagreed with his girlfriend, he would go quiet for days. He thought he was protecting himself or even teaching her a lesson, but what he didn't realize was how much that silence was affecting her sense of emotional safety. Emotional safety is the foundation of any relationship. It's the feeling that you can speak your mind, express yourself, and be seen without fear of punishment or abandonment. When someone uses silence strategically or even unconsciously, this safety gets shaken. For James's girlfriend, every time he withdrew, her brain immediately went into "what did I do wrong" mode. She started questioning her behavior, analyzing every message, and wondering if the relationship was unstable. Even though James believed he was being fair or justified, the effect was the opposite. He created insecurity. Silence communicates more than words sometimes. Absence, especially after conflict, can signal rejection, anger, or disapproval, even if that's not the intention. James thought he was being strong, but his girlfriend experienced unpredictability. She couldn't read him, she couldn't predict his reactions, and that uncertainty triggered stress responses in her brain. Psychologically, humans crave predictability in attachment. They need to know that when something is said or felt, it will be met with understanding or at least acknowledgement. James's silence broke that expectation. What's interesting and critical for men to understand is that silence can sometimes feel like a win for the person using it. James initially felt that by not engaging, he was taking control and showing boundaries. And he was right in one sense. Boundaries are important, but boundaries and emotional withholding are not the same thing. A boundary is clear, explained, and consistent. Silence as a tactic is ambiguous and unpredictable. It leaves the other person guessing, which creates anxiety, not respect. Over time, this kind of pattern can erode trust. James's girlfriend started to feel emotionally unsafe, which affected her willingness to open up or be vulnerable. That's the subtle danger of silence. It doesn't have to be aggressive to be harmful. A few days of quiet here and there might seem harmless, but when it becomes a pattern, it slowly chips away at connection, intimacy, and the sense of being understood. The lesson here is simple but often overlooked. Emotional safety matters more than proving a point. James eventually learned that taking time to cool off is fine, but disappearing without explanation communicates something entirely different than he intended. Silence, when misused, can create fear and doubt rather than respect and reflection. And in a relationship, fear is never a good substitute for influence or authority. Understanding this distinction is what separates emotional maturity from emotional manipulation. 5. The hidden fear behind withdrawal. There's always a reason why someone withdraws in a relationship, and it's rarely just about needing space. Most of the time, it's fear, and that fear drives behavior in ways men often don't realize. I once worked with a man I'll call Marcus, who kept pulling away from his girlfriend every time they had a disagreement. On the surface, Marcus appeared calm and collected, but underneath, he was operating from a deep fear of rejection. Marcus told me he thought ignoring her was the best way to handle conflict. He believed that if he spoke, he might say the wrong thing, get rejected, or seem weak. So instead, he went silent. In his mind, silence was safety. But here's the tricky part. What felt safe for him often caused his girlfriend immense anxiety. She interpreted his withdrawal as a signal that he was upset, disappointed, or even ready to leave. Her brain started filling in the blanks, imagining worst-case scenarios, and the emotional tension escalated. Marcus' fear didn't disappear. It just shifted into a different dynamic. He thought he was protecting himself, but he was inadvertently creating fear in her. This is the psychology behind most withdrawal patterns. When someone ignores another person, it usually isn't about power or manipulation. It's about avoiding discomfort. Fear of confrontation, fear of vulnerability, or fear of not being understood. In Marcus' case, every time he pulled away, he was avoiding a conversation that might force him to face his own insecurities. The irony is that the behavior designed to protect him often made the relationship feel unstable, which in turn intensified his anxiety. Men often mistake this fear-driven withdrawal for strength. They think, "I'm handling this like a man, I'm not overreacting." But real strength isn't measured by how long you can stay quiet or how much tension you can create in the other person. Strength is measured by your ability to stay grounded, communicate honestly, and face discomfort without hurting the other person's emotional safety. Marcus's silence felt like control, but it was really avoidance. And avoidance always carries consequences. The lesson here is that withdrawal can mask fear in ways men rarely acknowledge. Silence can temporarily give a sense of relief or superiority, but it's usually hiding something more vulnerable: the fear of rejection, the fear of conflict, or the fear of being truly seen. The problem is that this fear doesn't exist in isolation. It creates a ripple effect that affects the other person's emotional state, trust, and connection. Marcus's girlfriend began to doubt the stability of their bond, not because of what he said, but because of what he didn't say. For men watching, understanding the hidden fear behind withdrawal is crucial. Ignoring someone isn't inherently wrong, but when it's driven by avoidance rather than intention, it harms both parties. Recognizing your own fears and learning to communicate through them is what turns silence from a weapon into a tool for clarity and growth. Marcus eventually realized this. True strength isn't about withholding, it's about being present even when it's uncomfortable. 6. When ignoring backfires. Psychologically, ignoring a woman might feel like a strategy at first, but the reality is that it often backfires, sometimes in ways men don't expect. The psychology behind it is surprisingly simple. Humans are wired to respond to emotional uncertainty, and when someone intentionally creates that uncertainty, it triggers stress, mistrust, and even resentment. What starts as a perceived win can quickly turn into a loss. I've seen this countless times in my practice. Men come in boasting about how they went quiet for days or weeks after an argument, expecting to feel more in control. At first, it works. They get the attention they wanted. She texts more, calls, or tries to engage. But here's the twist. Over time, the very behavior they thought would give them power begins to erode trust. Emotional connection doesn't grow in silence. It diminishes. The woman starts doubting not just the relationship, but the man himself. She wonders if he's emotionally reliable, if he can handle conflict, or if he's truly invested. That doubt doesn't disappear even if he eventually comes back around. Ignoring can backfire in another subtle way. It teaches the wrong lessons. When a man withdraws to get a reaction, it communicates that emotional manipulation is acceptable. The other person learns to navigate the relationship through guessing and chasing, rather than open communication. That dynamic might seem like control in the short term, but it creates a cycle of tension and insecurity that only intensifies with time. Eventually, the person being ignored either disengages or begins to mirror the same behavior, creating a relationship built on fear and uncertainty rather than mutual respect. Another psychological backfire is internal. Men who rely on silence as a tactic often think they are in control, but internally, they are trapped by the very behavior they are using. They obsess over her reaction, replay interactions in their head, and experience guilt or frustration if the results aren't exactly as they imagined. What started as a way to feel powerful turns into a self-imposed pressure that is exhausting and emotionally draining. In short, ignoring someone to provoke a reaction often creates as much stress for the person doing it as it does for the one being ignored. The critical takeaway here is that ignoring is not neutral. It is action by omission. Every time a man withdraws to influence or provoke, he is creating consequences, whether he sees them immediately or not. Emotional manipulation, even subtle, always has a psychological cost. The relationship becomes less about connection and more about testing boundaries, which ultimately undermines long-term stability. For men, the lesson is clear. Silence can be powerful, but only if it's intentional and self-directed. Using it as a tool to provoke, punish, or control almost always backfires. Emotional maturity isn't about disappearing to see what happens. It's about presence, awareness, and the ability to navigate discomfort without hurting the person you care about. Ignoring can feel like strength, but in reality, it only builds tension, not respect. The real power lies in clarity, honesty, and emotional responsibility. 7. Choosing awareness over emotional games. By the time men get to this point, they often realize something crucial. Ignoring a woman is rarely about her. It's about you. It's about your fears, your insecurities, your need to feel in control. And this is where awareness becomes the game changer. Awareness is what separates men who build strong, resilient relationships from men who unknowingly sabotage the connection they value. Think of it this way. When a man uses silence as a weapon, he's essentially playing a game with emotions. He's hoping to provoke a reaction, to make her chase, to feel the upper hand. In the moment, it can feel effective, but games are short-lived. They rely on manipulation, on guessing, on testing boundaries. Eventually, the person on the receiving end stops responding the way you expect. Or worse, they start playing back, creating a cycle of tension, distrust, and miscommunication. Emotional games might give you a thrill at first, but they rarely lead to genuine intimacy or respect. I've worked with men who told me they wanted to be unshakable, untouchable, or unreachable. They thought that by ignoring their partner they were showing strength, but what they didn't realize was how much of their energy went into maintaining that image. Checking phones, replaying conversations, anticipating reactions, all of it was draining them emotionally. Awareness changes that. Awareness teaches that your power doesn't come from absence, but from clarity and self-possession. You can create calm and boundaries without causing fear or confusion. In practice, awareness means recognizing your intentions before you withdraw. Ask yourself, am I stepping back to process my emotions and regain clarity, or am I waiting to see how she reacts? The first option builds emotional intelligence. The second option builds tension, insecurity, and resentment. Awareness also means acknowledging the impact of your silence. You don't need to apologize for needing space, but you do need to understand that your choices affect the other person. Emotional maturity is about owning that responsibility without guilt or defensiveness. When men learn to operate from awareness, the results are profound. They can take space without triggering panic. They can step back without feeling guilty. They can remain calm in conflict while still being present and connected. Relationships become less about emotional warfare and more about collaboration, understanding, and mutual respect. The power that comes from awareness is subtle, steady, and far more effective than temporary reactions achieved through silence. Here's the bottom line for men. Ignoring a woman isn't inherently wrong, but using it as a tool to manipulate or control is. The only way to avoid the pitfalls of silence is to act with awareness. Recognize your fears, understand your motivations, and take ownership of your choices. Emotional intelligence and clarity are far more attractive than games or absence. True influence comes not from forcing reactions, but from being grounded in yourself and making conscious decisions that honor both your emotions and hers. When you choose awareness over emotional games, you stop reacting unconsciously and start leading the relationship with integrity, respect, and self-confidence. Silence in a relationship is a tool, not a weapon. Its impact depends entirely on intention and awareness. Ignoring a woman might feel powerful at first, but without emotional clarity, it often creates fear, confusion, and mistrust. True strength isn't measured by how long you can stay quiet, but by how present, grounded, and self-aware you are. Understanding the difference between taking space and controlling emotions is key. When you act from awareness instead of fear, you preserve connection, respect, and intimacy. Emotional maturity turns silence into clarity, not conflict, and builds influence that lasts far longer than any temporary reaction.